Merry met, virtual traveller, and welcome to Stories of the Sun, a limited episode podcast created as a companion to the book Stories of the Sun, published by the History Press and written by me, Dawn Nelson, an author and professional storyteller. The idea for this book began when I challenged myself to get up once a month over the year to watch the sunrise in order to reconnect with the sun and its stories. Throughout the 8 episodes, I will include some snippets of audio that I recorded especially for this podcast. This episode explores liminal spaces, what may dwell there, and why they are where it's all happening. But first, grab yourself a cuppa, find a comfy spot, and come with me now to my sit spot on the hill.
It's now 3 minutes past 7. I'm not sure whether you can hear it on the recording. I can definitely hear Mr. Crow. But there's every now and then there's a sort of a mewing, sort of crying, more sort of human sound. And that's the Mediterranean gulls. I talk about those in the book. The beautiful violet sky that there was that morning. That's one of the images from this project that does stay in my head. Mr. Crow has been joined by 2 other crows, which means that there is now a murder of crows behind me. It's a great tit in the woodland. It is teacher, teacher, teacher. The sun's still not quite here yet. I have learnt during this project, though, that patience is required, and that she will appear when she is good and ready. And she's normally not fully in the sky until about half an hour after the scheduled sunrise. When I say scheduled, I mean the Met Office's scheduled sunrise.
The liminal space between night and day is one that many of us frequently cross without really paying attention to it. This space, along with crossroads, bridges, graveyards, hedgerows, snickets and alleys, are places on the edges of our conscience. We know they are there, sure, and sometimes we encounter them every day, but what they represent, many of us have buried deep in our brains, labelled, best not to think too hard about it. But the liminal space is where it's all at. The one I'm particularly interested in for this episode is the grey gloaming of nautical twilight. There are 3 phases of twilight: astronomical, nautical and civil. And in February's chapter of the book, I look at these a little closer. Most of us don't even realise that civil twilight exists, as to us it's simply a time of day when we can start to see clearly. And astronomical twilight is just the cusp of the night. You're barely able to see that the light's returning at that point. Nautical twilight is that magical bit in between. It takes its name from the fact that sailors were able to take readings from the stars and also see large objects on the shoreline, making navigation easier. But it is also, at this point, in both the morning and the evening, that your eyes can play tricks on you. Shapes loom out of the hedgerows, and you can't see what made that twig snap underfoot, and you're pretty sure it wasn't you. You're still relying heavily on your other senses, and if there is a high wind at this time in the morning, well, I've discovered it can be a little unnerving, even if you know the landscape well. You can't hear because of the wind, and if you can't hear clearly and you can't see clearly, when you're used to being able to do so usually, well, then you're all at sea. What it does mean, though, is that once you reach your sit spot, hunker down and wait, the creatures of the liminal space will soon join you. During my 11 sunrises and 1 sunset, I was joined by roe deer, rabbits, bats, tawny owls, barn owls, countless birds, from blackbirds to kingfishers, slugs, snails and crickets, and that's just the highlights. Highlights, Dawn? Really? Slugs? Yeah, slugs. There are so many different slugs out there, folks, and the variety of species of snail I found one morning was incredible. But I'll leave the snails for you to read in May's chapter in the book, along with some most excellent folklore and stories I discovered, including a stained glass window that features snails. But I digress. I still visit the field and occasionally watch a sunrise there, and there are my favourites that I watch out for. The pheasant that seems to like sitting in trees, the roebuck who, the last time I saw him, fell out of the edge of the forest and surprised us both, and the love story that is the tawny owls and the tree behind where I sit, their frantic calling as civil twilight creeps under the tree line. What I find so fascinating about these crepuscular moments is how tolerant my animal neighbours are of my blundering self. It's as if they know I do not possess a tapetum lucidum, that handy thin reflective surface just behind their retina that helps them to see more clearly in the dark. Humans just don't have them. They peer at me from wherever they are, knowing full well I cannot see as clearly as they can, and that I am no threat at all. I still remember the look of pity on the doe's face as I stumbled up the path under the trees, before she ran off with her fawn, barking, or was that laughing, at the clumsy human attempting to join them that morning. At the other end of the day, pipistrelle bats deftly avoided my head as I walked across the meadow where they zigzagged, catching tiny moths iridescent in the half-light. And bush crickets sang to each other, hopping clear of my booted feet. I was painfully aware that I was all too visible to them, but they were not always to me. And that was the magic of it. That was dancing in the liminal space. Next month, at the very end of the month, the sun will set on April and rise on May. This is the night of Beltane, one of the 2 points in the year where a slightly different liminal space opens up. Some call it the veil, a wall that divides us from this world and the other world. For Beltane, this other world is the world of the Fae, and for Samhain, in October, the other world is the world of the dead. But let's stick with the Fae for now. On Beltane night, I will join revellers at Butser Ancient Farm to listen to folk music, drumming and morris dancers, whilst I tell stories, eat, drink and be merry, not necessarily in that order. It's a glorious celebration of spring, and as the sun sets, we stand in a crepuscular light before setting fire to the carefully sculpted themed willow in the far-off field, and then dancing in the liminal space. It's one of my favourite times of year. So next time you have the opportunity, find that moment of nautical twilight and dance. For more on the 3 twilights and the creatures I found there on my sunrises, take a look at February's chapter in Stories of the Sun. To discover the snails and more about Beltane celebrations, read the May chapter. And I'll be back next time to explore how there cannot be light without dark. Thanks for joining me for this episode. As always, reviews are enormously helpful. So if you enjoyed this podcast, please leave me a review either on Apple iTunes or via my Facebook. Both are very welcome and really help these stories to travel out into the world and connect with new souls. Stories of the Sun is now available to buy in bookshops. And for more folklore and stories, you can subscribe to my Substack newsletter. Just hop over to the Substack site and search for Ceridwen's Cauldron, or use the link in the show notes. You can upgrade to paid for just £5 a month for an extra dose of wild storytelling to your inbox, which includes podcast extras for Stories from Lore, my other podcast, and Stories of the Sun. Signing up as a paid or free subscriber is much appreciated and helps to support the podcasts and my work with folklore and story. Podcast extras for Stories of the Sun include a full, uninterrupted version of the audio for the sunrise featured at the beginning of this podcast, behind the scenes, journaling activities, and extra stories. You can find me on Instagram as @dd_storyteller, on Facebook as DD Storyteller, and via Substack as Ceridwen's Cauldron. I hope to see you there, as I'd love to tell you another story. I'll see you next time. Toodle pip.